Welcome to HR Studio Podcast. Through bi-weekly interviews with HR executives, thought leaders, authors, speakers, and trend spotters from the world of HR and beyond, we invite you to listen, learn, and leverage. Welcome to HR Studio Podcast, building the next generation of HR leaders. HR Studio Podcast is brought to you by A.J. O'Connor Associates, a trusted human capital consulting partner to emerging, mid-market, and world-class organizations. To learn more, visit us at ajoconnor.com.
Everyone, to HR Studio Podcast. My name is Fred Bunsa, and I'm going to be your host for today's episode. Today, we're thrilled to be joined by Libby Gill from the West Coast. Libby knows a lot of change. She grew up on 2 continents and went to 8 different schools before putting herself through college by waiting on tables. We're not going to talk about waiting on tables, but we are going to talk about some of her other experience. She started in the communications world as an assistant at Embassy Communications, a television company founded by Norman Lear, creator of All in the Family, among other things, and then survived 3 mergers, ultimately becoming head of publicity and advertising for Sony Worldwide. Then she went on to lead public relations and corporate communications at Universal and Turner Broadcasting before getting the entrepreneurial bug to jump out on her own and join the coaching and consulting ranks, where she has her own company in California called Libby Gill and Company. For 15 years, she's been guiding clients through change and chaos, and we wanted to talk to Libby about her book called The Hope-Driven Leader, Harness the Power of Positivity at Work. And what we're most interested in is Libby's thesis that hope actually is a strategy. So, Libby, after that introduction, welcome to HR Studio Podcast.
Thank you so much. I am delighted to be here. I think HR folks are not my unsung heroes because I work with them all the time and adore the intensity of the work and the people focus. But sometimes in corporations, they tend to be behind the scenes and unsung. So the fact that you are here addressing their challenges, I think, is really, really important.
Thank you. So what the first question I'd like to ask is what inspired you to write the book?
Well, I've always felt like hope was my kind of secret jet fuel. It was it was sort of the sense of you can lose your money, you can lose your health, you can even lose relationships, but if you have hope, it actually comes from an Old English word, hopian, which means to leap forward with the expectation. So if you've got this sense of hope that things will get better, if I take action, things are going to improve a little bit here, a little bit. So that was always kind of my jet fuel. And I grew up in a very troubled and chaotic family, alcoholism, mental illness, and, hope got me out of bed in the morning.
Interesting. And so tell us a little bit about your thesis, and it sounds strange when you first hear it, but that hope is a strategy, because we often hear, of course, the opposite of that hope is absolutely not a strategy. So tell us about how that came about.
Right. We hear hope is not a strategy, hope is not a plan. When I wrote a book years ago called Traveling Hopefully. The title came from a Robert Louis Stevenson quote: "To travel hopefully is a better thing than to arrive." I discovered this body of research called hope theory that comes out of medicine and positive psychology. And there are 2 real Dr. C.R. Snyder, who decided he would go on his sabbatical. He was going to go study up on hope. So he was a professor at the University of Kansas, went to the library to check out the academic research, the books, and he discovered there weren't any. And so he thought, well, I guess it's because no one thought they could measure it. And like any good social scientist, then of course he built a scale called the Adult Dispositional Hope Scale that I actually recreated with your ability to connect with the future. Do you have a realistic sense of what is doable, what is attainable, and do you have the willpower to get there?
Okay,
and then,
so it's about connecting to the future and your willpower to get there. That's it would be the clinical definition of hope, as you say?
Yeah, I'm not sure there's a clinical definition. There's also someone who comes out of medicine.
Okay.
Dr. Ron Groopman, who was an early AIDS researcher and a Harvard-trained oncologist, and he said, hope was a fundamental belief that change was possible, kind of foundational, and then an expectation that it is the actions of the individual that drives the outcome.
Okay.
Where sometimes we think, oh, it's a government or my boss or my spouse or whatever. So I sort of put those two together. And to me, it's linking belief with behavior. When you say, I believe this, and you act upon it, and not everybody stops to look at what they believe. So you can sort of check yourself, look at your calendar, see where you spend all your time. Look at your financial statements. Where did you spend your money? Where did you put most of your energy? That's your belief set right there. And there's a trail to let you know if you're unsure of what your beliefs are. That's probably it. But are they connected to where you want to go is the question.
Okay, so it's this connection of belief and behavior. And I think what I heard you say is a great gut check for what do you believe is where do you spend your time and your money?
Right.
Okay,
right.
Interesting. So how did it evolve into this notion of being a strategy? Tell us a little more about that.
Sure. So these two built a body of science and data around this, and then both wrote treatises on hope theory, and one was from the clinical perspective in medicine that, in fact, it's, anybody who's had a long-term illness or has had a family member who has, we know that they really need to participate in the healing process. And Dr. Groupman, the oncologist, found that early in his career, he would give all the data to his patients only to discover that it shut them down and overwhelmed, which we also see in the business world. You hit people over the head with too much information, and this is where sort of the annual appraisal comes in. If that's a surprise and a shock, you're doing something wrong.
Okay, yeah. If they're surprised, you didn't do something along the way that you should have.
Exactly. So what he did then is he went all the way to the other end of the spectrum, which I also see in the workplaces. Okay, I'm going to correct that. And then we overcorrect. And he began giving his patients, his cancer patients, too little information, and saw that it left them with a false sense, what he called false hope, that they had this sense of, no news is good news, everything's okay. And he had to find that middle ground of what is real, what is practical, and then discovered that it was not just the, mind over matter kind of mysticism, but in fact, during the healing process, when we believe that we are participants and that hope is possible, that we release the brain chemicals necessary to suppress pain and to boost the immune system. So we, in fact, play a part in that in a very physiological sense.
Wow, that's amazing. I want to talk about how this translates into the HR function overall, but are there any other key pieces of it, of the science that you were describing that will tee us up for the HR discussion?
Well, this one may sound a little bleak, but there was a study done in San Antonio, Texas, on the link of mortality and hopefulness. And they found there was a significant correlation of people who were stewards of their future, people who really had a sense of what life will be like in 5 or 10 or 20 years. And it seems obvious, but they really did take better care of their health. They saved money. They did all of these things. And it was a huge number of people that were hopeless that died at a younger age. So it's pretty shocking when you think, hey, I'm going to be around for a while and I'm going to plan and protect for that.
So what can we do as rising HR leaders to bring this body of science that you've been talking about related to hope into the planning or the processes or the people that we spend our time thinking about and working on each day?
Well, HR folks are so often the holders of the culture. They are the ones, they can't do it by themselves, obviously, but I really believe that they can set an example. And one thing I talk about in my book is that social behaviors are really contagious. Just like yawning and smiling, that if we set that tone intentionally, not just like, I'm going to try and have a good day, but the way you begin a conversation is very often the way that interaction is left. So if you start with hey, we got a big problem here and you got to fix this person on your team, as opposed to, and sometimes it's become a bit of a cliche, there's an opportunity for growth here that people kind of chuckle at. We've got
Right.
kind of language. But in fact, there is again some good science to back up the fact that if you start with the solution, that we can do this, we can figure this out together, that the parts of your brain that are connected to creativity and problem solution fire up. And we know this from the MRIs and magnetic resonance imaging and all of that. So begin that at that high level of expectation. So set that tone for all things are possible. Not that, and I tell my coaching clients, okay, you're 60, maybe you won't be a professional baseball player or an astronaut or a ballerina at this stage of life, but that doesn't mean you can't find that value in some other outlet. So HR people, you're not meant to be the soul crushers or the corporate cops. And I had in communication, I often felt like I was the one that was swooping down saying, you can't do this and you can't say this.
Right.
But if you are able to communicate the benefit and connect it directly to that person and their future, then people get that, that emotional gut check of the what's in it for me. And as human beings, I mean, we're big animals. We think second, we feel first. So if you connect with those emotions, you really get people on board rather than connecting with logic and reasoning. That comes afterwards.
Okay. And so did you have some strategies for HR leaders in how they can be intentional or more intentional about modeling this kind of a hope-filled, future-focused approach?
Well, it can't be a Pollyanna kind of thing. I mean, everybody's got their own style. But one thing I always look at is first take care of yourself. And you hear that. But I think the healers and helpers of the world and in the corporate world, that is HR, just like nurses and healthcare, teachers and education. We are sometimes, you all, humble to a fault. Not always a good thing. You need to occasionally shine a light on your own accomplishments and that of your team so that you can feel great and purposeful and make sure people know that. So don't undersell your value ever. I mean, I've been in business for a long time. I've seen HR go from the days of personnel where it was, sort of weeding through resumes to being a true strategic partner. I mean, there are people that's the first hire as my people officer. And so recognize your own value. And then one other thing I love for people to do on their own behalf and then also for the organization is you've got your day job. You know what the organization wants. You know what you're meant to do every day. But step outside of that for a minute and think of what do you want to have happen in a year? Not necessarily something that people are asking you for. It's in that Franklin Covey box of urgent, but I forget how they word that. But it's not, nobody's assigned it or was waiting for it, but in your heart of hearts, you can move the needle on people, on development. And think about it in terms of a year span. What would you truly like to do in a year? Is it build the bench strength of your next wave of leaders? Is it turn your millennials into grown-up, really value-oriented people that understand the corporate culture? Whatever that is, starting an internship program, addressing women's issues. And I like to think of it in terms of a year. If you can do it in a month, it's too easy. If you think, well, I could do this in the next 5 years, it's too abstract and far away. And be very clear on that vision and then reverse engineer it to today in quarters, in months, in weeks. And it's not to say that you have to do every piece of it, but if you don't step out and think, what else? What else can I do? And this works in your own life as well. Whether you want to learn a language, travel the world, get fit, find a relationship, all of those things, it really is clarify the vision, simplify the pathway, remove the extraneous, bring in the necessary, and execute the plan. And it's all about the execution. And that's where you need accountability, measurement, partners to help you so that you can stay the course.
Well, Libby, it sounds like you've done this a lot with people and your experience is coming through. It sounds like a great sort of endorsement of the coaching approach that we employ with people, right, is helping them to envision something that's possible but not likely unless they do a lot of effort and put a plan in place, and then following that plan through and having an accountability partner. That's the essence of a strong coaching plan.
Mm-hmm. And another reason to address your earlier question, Fred, that I really looked at hope is because as a coach and I go into environments, it's often, sometimes it's a derailed executive or an executive who needs some development, which used to happen much more often in terms of, you're being called into the principal's office. Now, coaching is clearly, this is an investment in this valued employee's future. And that's what coaching is frequently about. But I found there was a sense of hopelessness in the sense of, gee, I don't really see my way to the future. I don't know what's next for me in this organization. And that sense of there was a bit of a vacuum in terms of really visualizing that positive future. And the more HR people can really help paint that visceral, this is what your leaders see for you. This is what we see in your future. This is what we know you're capable of with the right resources and tools and training, which we're here to provide. So that's where people get this sense of, oh my gosh, I can do that. I can see that just ahead. And that gets people excited.
Yeah. And are there any downsides to this kind of a more hope-filled or hope as a strategy? Are there any downsides, or are there any ways that I think about people typically overplay this, and there's a pitfall, or there's an obstacle there that you've seen in working with people over the years?
I don't think so. The only obstacle is if you don't attach actions to the vision.
Okay.
And I've had this happen. I had a coaching client who had a business model that she'd put together, and 7 years in, she had yet to turn a profit, which is, about 5 years after most people would throw in the towel. And she was adamant it was going to work. And I suggested she change the model and try something different, and she wouldn't. And then she came back about a year later to bring me on to help her message the closing down of her business. And it was really sad, but that was I'm putting on those rose-colored glasses and I'm not measuring anything. I'm just going on blind faith and false hope. But I don't see that very often in the corporate world. There are too many checks and balances. I think we're much better to go over to the side of, let's be hopeful about the future. Let's paint an attainable picture, but a lofty one of what's possible.
Wow. So, Libby, besides your book, Hope Driven Leader, are there any other books or resources that you found particularly helpful that folks in our audience of rising HR leaders could access to dig in a little bit more about like the science and some of the technical pieces behind this? Because I would think that some of them would want to bring that to bear with their leaders who might be more interested in not just grand plans, but what's the science behind why we'd want to embrace this as a leadership team?
Well, there's an interesting one. It is not a business book, but the Dr. Jerome Griffin, the oncologist I mentioned, has a book that he's a physician, but it's so highly readable, called The Anatomy of Hope, where he really talks about the true science, the clinical basis of this idea of hopefulness. And that, to me, I mean, I've read it a number of times. You can read it in one sitting. It's fascinating when he then becomes a patient with a back injury. In the universe, going that full circle of the doctor becomes the patient, and how does hope then play into his life? So that's really interesting. And there's another book that I love called Change or Die, which sounds a little bleak, but it is really about medical patients who were told by their doctors, change your lifestyle habits, or you've got about 2 years to live. And of that, less than 10% make those lifestyle changes. And this is a journalist. It's shocking.
Wow.
But there are people that break through. And this is a journalist who tracked some of the specific people and organizations of ex-convicts that go straight, of obese people who lose the weight and become fit. And it's fascinating what the common thread is among all of those. And then, of course, there's my other favorite book of mine, You Unstuck, that looks at neuroscience and why do we stay stuck in our own habits and how do we break past that?
Great. So we'll put a link to those. The Anatomy of Hope, you said, right? Change or Die, and Unstuck. We'll put a link to those in our show notes for those of you who'd like to read a little bit more about that. And Libby, as we wrap up the podcast today, what final advice, or what would you like to reemphasize, or even a new idea to just help our rising HR leaders really embrace this idea of hope is a strategy?
Well, I will quote my favorite self-help and HR guru, Albert Einstein.
Okay.
He said, "Learn from yesterday, live for today, hope for tomorrow." And I think that's a great summation of how we could all aspire to live.
One more time for that. It's a great quote from Albert Einstein.
He said, "Learn from yesterday, live for today, hope for tomorrow." Excellent.
Great. Well, Libby Gill, thank you so much for being with us today and for sharing your thoughts around hope as a strategy. We'll put links in the show notes to your book, The Hope-Driven Leader. And for those of you who are not yet subscribers to HR Studio Podcast, please feel free to log on to hrstudiopodcast.com, where you'll find the show notes for today. You'll find a way to subscribe. And actually, Libby has generously offered to put a link there for the first chapter of her book, so you can get started in reading about that. And we would welcome your subscribership. So Libby, thank you once again for being on the podcast today. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the HR Studio Podcast. To download complimentary resources from this week's episode and to catch up on past episodes, please visit hrstudiopodcast.com. Subscribe to the HR Studio podcast list and social channels while there to receive alerts and recaps on all our episodes. HR Studio Podcast is brought to you by A.J. O'Connor Associates. For over 35 years, AJO has built its reputation on experienced listening, exceptional quality, and caring partnerships, delivering in 30 states and 20 countries. To learn more and subscribe to AJO's Top 100 HR blog, visit us at ajoconnor.com.